On a bright and peaceful morning, James, a black man in his early 60s with silvery hair and weathered skin, entered a jewelry store. He had been saving up for months to buy a special gift for his son, Michael, who was about to turn 30. James wanted to show his love and appreciation for his son, who had been a constant source of support throughout his life. Inside the store, the owner, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a friendly demeanor, was chatting with a young woman dressed in a bright red dress. The two seemed to be in a lighthearted conversation, laughing and whispering to each other. James stood at the entrance for a moment, observing the scene before approaching the counter. As James stepped forward to ask about a watch, the shopkeeper suddenly froze, his expression changing from amusement to alarm. "It's gone!" he shouted in panic. "The diamond! It's gone!" His voice shook with fear as his eyes darted around the room. Then his gaze fell on James, and without any hesitation, he pointed a trembling finger at him. You took it!" James was shocked by the accusation. He tried to explain that he had no knowledge of any stolen item, but the shopkeeper quickly grabbed his phone and called the police. Panic spread throughout the store as the situation escalated. James was confused and scared, unable to understand what was happening. Soon Officer Reed arrived. A tall man with a stern face, Reed had an intimidating presence. As he entered, he barely glanced at James before muttering, "Thieves," under his breath. Without a word, Reed roughly grabbed James and slammed him against the wall. "You're under arrest," Reed said coldly. Before James could even respond, the officer punched him in the face, sending him crashing to the ground. James cried out in pain, his hands instinctively reaching for his face, but Reed didn't listen to his pleas. James was taken to the station, where Reed showed no mercy. The officer threw him into a dark, cold cell and began interrogating him relentlessly. "Admit it," Reed shouted. "You stole it, didn't you?" But James refused to confess to a crime he did not commit. Days passed, and James endured harsh conditions in the cell. The interrogations continued, each one more intense than the last. Reed demanded that James admit guilt, but James held firm, despite the pain and hunger he suffered. Meanwhile, Daniel, James's son, had just returned from a long business trip. As soon as he walked into the house, he noticed something was wrong. His father was nowhere to be found. After asking the neighbors, he learned about his father's arrest. Daniel was filled with shock and concern. He quickly went to the police station and demanded to see his father. Reed refused, dismissing Daniel with contempt. "Your father is a thief, and nothing will change that," he sneered. Daniel's temper flared. As a heavyweight boxer, he wasn't afraid to confront Reed. Without thinking, Daniel charged at Reed and punched him with all his strength, knocking out 3 of Reed's gold teeth. Reed screamed in pain, clutching his mouth. Daniel stood his ground, his eyes filled with fury. "You'll pay for this," Reed yelled, his voice trembling with rage. "I'll make sure you're locked up too." Daniel realized the situation was escalating quickly and fled the scene before Reed could retaliate. Meanwhile, the pressure on James continued to mount. Reed became even more aggressive, trying to force him into a confession. He threatened James, telling him that if he didn't admit to the theft, his son would face even worse consequences. In the end, James, wanting to protect his son from further harm, reluctantly agreed to confess, even though he was innocent. The confession was his sacrifice for Daniel, hoping that it would end the torment. On the day of the trial, James stood nervously in front of the judge. The judge asked him, "Do you plead guilty?" Just as James was about to respond, the doors to the courtroom suddenly burst open. Daniel stepped in, followed by a woman, Emily, Reed's wife. Reed stared at Emily in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Emily remained silent, her head bowed. Daniel confidently walked forward and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I have brought the real thief here today." Daniel presented irrefutable evidence, including surveillance footage and witness testimony. It was revealed that Emily had stolen the diamond, and the shopkeeper had been deceived by her. The judge immediately ordered her arrest. Reed stood in shock as his career crumbled. The judge announced his demotion to a janitor as punishment for his unjust actions toward James. Reed was left standing there, humiliated and defeated. James was finally freed. He was reunited with his son in the courtroom, and the two embraced tightly, tears of joy flowing. The injustice had been righted, and father and son could finally return home to live in peace.